Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar addressing our initial thoughts and speculation on the incoming Biden administration and what we expect to change and stay the same in the areas of labor, employment, and education law. My name is Eris Dalianis, a partner at the Franzik firm. We're delighted to have you with us for the next hour to discuss some of the most timely and urgent questions facing employers, colleges and universities, and Illinois school boards and administrators. With me this morning is a team of Franzik attorneys covering the range of our practices. Let me introduce you to my partners, Bill Pokorny.
Morning.
Jennifer Smith.
Hello.
Nikki Baser. And David Johnson.
Hello.
We welcome your questions during the webinar. Please submit them through the Q&A function on Zoom rather than the chat function. We'll do our best to answer them along the way. So with that, let's get started. We're going to be covering labor, employment, and education law issues today and talk about substantive and other significant changes that we foresee happening under the Biden administration. Bill, perhaps you can kick things off first by talking about the tools that the president will have at his disposal to make change and how he might use some of those tools.
Sure. So let's start off by talking about appointments. One of the first things that any new president coming into the White House has the ability to do is put people in key positions. And it's no coincidence that over the last couple of weeks since the election, we have heard a lot of talk and speculation and announcements from the president-elect's incoming administration about who they will be placing in certain key slots. And that's not only the headliner cabinet positions, but also positions sort of down the card in administrative agencies, for example, the NLRB, EEOC, OSHA, that have an important influence over policy. So, the first and what we're seeing right now and hearing a lot of talk about is filling in those appointments. And so, Nikki, were you going to talk about the president's power to or influence over the legislative process?
I am. I'm going to shut off my camera. Hopefully you guys can hear me right now. I'm having a little bit of internet issues. So if you can't hear me, Bill, I'm going to kick it over to you.
We can hear you, Nikki.
Okay, great. So I apologize. My camera is off for just the time being, but hopefully my internet will resurrect itself at some point today. So Bill mentioned appointments legislation is obviously a way to effectuate pretty significant change. The president's power and Biden's power to get legislation through is obviously entirely dependent on Congress. Certainly the president can use the bully pulpit of the presidency to promote legislation, to exercise influence, to work the party. He also has the ability to veto legislation. But again, what we really are going to be looking for in terms of the ability of Biden to effectuate change through legislation is what happens in the Georgia election coming up. And if Republicans continue to control the Senate, the power to make significant change through legislation may indeed be limited. Obviously, there are going to be those issues where hopefully the Republicans and Democrats can come together. But again, we're gonna have to wait to see on that. There's likely going to be some significant challenges for some of the more progressive parts of Biden's legislative agenda if we don't see that Georgia election swing to the Democrats.
So Bill, how about let's talk about regulations too. That's another tool at the president's disposal. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely, Eris. So, the new administration can change existing regulations. So when Congress passes laws, often what they do is they delegate authority to the executive branch to fill in the gaps in those laws or to address technical aspects of the law that are inappropriate or difficult for Congress to address through the legislation itself. Sometimes, candidly, they're punting because there's not a political compromise, and they're allowing the administration to then fill in the gaps that Congress wasn't able to fill in. We see this a lot, for example, with environmental regulations. Congress creates a broad policy directive and then leaves it to the EPA to set the technical standards that industry and others are required to meet in order to fulfill those broad policy objectives. When we're talking about these official regulations that have the force of law, those can't just be adopted or changed at the drop of a hat. So it's not as though the administration can come in and on day one, or really even for the most part within the first 100 days, and do a complete about face on regulations that are currently on the books. There are extensive rules that the federal government has to follow in terms of public notice and comment and taking account of various factors before a rule can be changed. And even then, the authority to adopt rules is constrained by the legislation that grants the authority to adopt those rules in the first place. So the administration can't do something that is contrary to the power that Congress has delegated, or not within the powers that have been delegated by Congress. So we certainly do expect some regulatory activity, fair amount of regulatory activity from the Biden administration in a whole range of areas, but we also expect to see pushback on that because these regulations, given the procedures that have to be followed, are often subject to court challenge. And as we have seen, the Trump administration, one of the signatures of the Trump administration has been appointing nominees to the federal judiciary. And many of the nominees who have been appointed are much more conservative and take a much narrower view of the administration's ability to adopt regulations and to change regulations. So there is going to be quite a bit of litigation over many of the changes that we do expect to see.
So Jen, let me ask you this. This is something that's been in the news, I would say, since the George W. Bush administration, the tool of the executive order, where the president, in a sense, can't do what, or is unable to do what Bill talked about, which is work something through Congress or get something through the regulatory public comment period. So in a sense, they issue executive orders dealing with, talk about that a little bit, because that's a growing area of the law, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, executive orders, the federal government is not just a rule maker and regulation promulgator, but they're an enormous employer. They have a large operations. And so as far as managing those operations, it largely doesn't have to be done through, regulations. Regulations are for others, but as far as managing themselves, the president can make decrees. And a good example that I saw that kind of crosses the areas we're talking today as far as employment, education, is that in June, President Trump issued an executive order requiring all federal agencies to look at the degree requirements they have to hold employment positions with the federal government, and said wherever possible, you should remove degree requirements and base hiring on skills, not degrees. So again, that is more of broadcasting that it has logistical implications for hiring within the federal government, but it's also signaling to the country and modeling what they want to model for employers, and say something probably about degrees as well, right? So that's an example of how they could use one could use the executive order that has an impact on employers and educators.
And then Nikki, I know agencies are always sort of talking to their constituents formally and informally. How does some of that informal and formal communication work and affect labor, employment, educational entities?
Sure. So absolutely. I mean, what we see is obviously how agencies choose to interpret the law, interpret the regulations, where they devote resources in terms of enforcement. Can have a huge influence in the field. We're going to discuss a number of areas today where we're expecting to see shifts in priorities, and some of those are going to come, as we've said, through legislation and regulation, but some of those are going to come through how the agencies that ultimately this work trickles down to are interpreting and prioritizing. I mean, I think in the area of, I work in the K-12 area mostly, and certainly at higher ed as well, the informal and formal guidance that is issued by the Department of Education certainly has a great influence on how local school districts are looking at issues of civil rights. They're looking at issues of how to serve students with special education needs. I will say that in these areas, the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. So some districts, I think maybe at this point have thrown up their hands on these kinds of informal and formal guidances. But I do think that they hold a lot of sway in the field and are important, at least to understand where the federal government is coming from in terms of education priorities, or as you said, in the areas of labor and employment as well, and across the board, really.
Nikki, there was one, I think interesting, this kind of illustrates what you're saying about regulations. Recently, there was the Department of Ed had a Title IX blog, and they're actually giving guidance in this blog. And, we internally are we really following a blog, to figure out Title IX? And it's interesting, there was one court case, and they completely rejected following the blog, or that they would be in any way bound by the interpretation of the new Title IX regs in the blog. So I think it's super helpful to know how the agency is going to interpret it, and to get into their thoughts, or whoever's putting out the blog on their behalf thoughts. But no one's it really has limited. You have to be careful not to take it too far. It's not like what Bill's talking about, regulations. It's definitely not the law. So its value needs to be kind of considered as just someone saying what they think, which may not be the case eventually.
So Jen, if I hear you, you're saying don't cite a blog post in your brief, is what you're saying, right?
Well, I mean, you can cite it, and other people can disregard it. I think
there we go.
We're at this point.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just a fascinating issue. I mean, just to geek out on the law issues here, right? Because agencies, their interpretations of regulations and statutes are given deference by the courts. But how far does that trickle down when you start tweeting about issues, or, as you say, posting blogs? Are we supposed to follow all of it? How are you supposed to go? And I do think that that is a challenge for all of our folks on the ground, just trying to keep track of all of these different pieces of information. So we can leave it there, but you're sure to see more guidance coming out, if history is any indicator, certainly from the Department of Ed, if nowhere else. So.
Cool. So listen, we're talking about all this stuff coming out of Washington. One thing, if you watch the news or read the papers, is the president has been announcing his appointees for top positions. And he has not yet announced for the Department of Labor or the Department of Education. But David, maybe you can walk us through some of the leading names that have been put out there.
Yes, thank you, Eris. So far, as you can see up on the screen, there's 7 names have been bandied about as potential nominees for the Secretary of Labor. This would be one of President-elect Biden's high-profile appointments. Joe Biden, going back to the days before he was the vice president, back in the days when he was a Senate, was always a very strong proponent of unions. He got elected with a lot of union support. The union movement in the United States has high expectations for a Biden administration. Now, before I go into the names, the individuals, give you sort of a thumbnail description of the background of these candidates. One thing I think that's going to be perhaps overarching in terms of President Biden's consideration of who to nominate is the fact that at best he's going to face a very divided Congress. And as Bill was pointing out, the head of a federal agency does have a number of levers at his or her disposal to try and coax the direction of the law, to coax the direction of impact on working conditions, employment conditions. That would seem to argue for a nominee for the Secretary of Labor who has a very strong background, strong familiarity with Washington, D.C., with the agencies, someone who can really hit the ground running and make the maximum use of those levers, of those implements at his or her disposal, and to do so as quickly as possible, as effectively as possible. With that background, so one of the names that's being mentioned, of course, is Andy Levin. Andy Levin is currently a congressman from Michigan. He is basically from Michigan Democratic royalty. He is the son of Sandy. He is the nephew of Carl. He, along with Marty Walsh, who is currently the mayor of Boston, have basically been splitting most of the union support. In Levin's case, he has gotten support from the United Auto Workers and the Communication Workers Union. One potential strike against Levin is that the district he represents is viewed as vulnerable, is such that if you were to go into become the Secretary of Labor, there's some possibility, maybe even a likelihood, of the Republicans taking over that district. To the extent that's a concern, that would be certainly a strike against his being nominated for the Secretary of Labor, given the thinness of the majority of the Democrats have in the House. Another candidate is Sharon Block. She is currently the executive director of the Labor and Work-Life program at Harvard. She has a wealth, really, of Washington, D.C. experience. She worked on the Hill with Senator Ted Kennedy with his committee back in the day. And she also has the distinction of actually having been a member of the National Labor Relations Board for about 18 months during the Obama presidency. Hers was one of the so-called recess appointments that would end up being struck down in the courts. In addition to Sharon Block, we have Julie Su. Julie Su is the executive director of California's Labor and Workforce Development Agency. Doesn't have really pronounced Washington, D.C. ties, but she is viewed as being very effective and has a reputation for quote unquote getting things done in that agency. And she has even had some reasonably high praise from the Chamber of Commerce in California. One of the things that she has focused on in her role in California is this whole issue of so-called gig economy and the classification of whether an individual will be deemed a quote unquote employee for purposes of the labor laws or an independent contractor. She and her agency have been leading the charge on that in terms of trying to really pare back the emphasis on declaring, say, gig economy workers as independent contractors. And that's something that is very much at the center or at the core of Biden's labor program. And they would seem to be something that Julie Su should be well suited for. William Spriggs is another candidate whose name has been mentioned several times. He is a chief economist for the AFL-CIO, and he's also a professor of economics at Howard University. And he does have Washington experience. He was an assistant labor secretary during the Clinton administration. Seth Harris is a name that gets mentioned as well. He's currently a fellow at Cornell School of Labor and Industrial Relations. He was a deputy labor secretary under Obama. There are reports that unions are quote unquote lukewarm about Seth Harris, and there is some what might be characterized as distrust of his seeming support for the quote unquote gig economy. Another name that gets mentioned is Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders is Bernie Sanders. But with somewhat surprising, very little official union support for Bernie aside of the Transport Workers Union. Finally is Marty Walsh, currently the mayor of Boston. As I mentioned earlier, he has been splitting most of the union support with Andy Levin. He is a former official of the Laborers Union, has support from AFSCME. Rich Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO, has characterized him as a quote unquote great choice. He also has, of course, the support of the building trades. And he is viewed as being one of the more progressive members of the building trade union movement.
So
and
Dave,
those would be the nominees. So so-called, those are we were 5 minutes before we went on this webinar. We Googled to see if an appointment has been made. We could have an appointment as early as today or sometime this week.
So David, I have a question for you. What I have observed, and I think people have reported on it as well, is that President-elect Biden is nominating a lot of people that he is familiar with, that he's worked with in the past, and has a certain rapport or comfort level. Weighing that with all the other things you talked about, is there any one person on this list that you see as more likely than others to get the nod?
It's a hard question to answer, Eris. Given the split in union support between Walsh and Levin, if I have a dark horse candidate on this one, I think it might be Julie Su. And in part because of her of her reputation of running a very large agency out in California, even though she doesn't have much in the way of Washington, D.C. experience, and her emphasis on the whole issue of employee classification. I think that strikes at the heart of a lot of the people within the Biden administration.
Well, no, you bring up a good point that Bill's going to touch on a little bit later, is the whole concept of worker protection, and seems like she would fit that niche pretty well. But before we get there, I'm going to ask Nikki to talk about some of our Secretary of Education possibilities. Let's put it that way. Not nominees, but folks whose names have been mentioned on more than one occasion.
I'm happy to, but Jen, are you with us? Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, my internet keeps I'm having problems, but I'm here for now if you can hear me. So
oh, I think she may have froze again.
Nikki, why don't you take it? Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm going to jump in. I'm not going to go through in as much detail as Dave, mainly because Jen was going to talk, but let me just say one thing. Obviously, what we have on the screen there, we've got a couple of union folks, obviously very high up. Randy Weingarten needs no introduction to most of the folks on the call. And Ms. Garcia, former president of the NEA. So either one of those would represent, certainly reflect Biden's very strong teacher union and teacher support, educator support. What's interesting is we also have folks, who represent sort of the other side of the picture insofar as they come from school district roles. Obviously, we have to point out, our favorite candidate, who would be Janice Jackson, the CEO of Chicago Public Schools, who we cannot say enough good things about. This really is somewhat of a wide open field. We had anticipated someone who had worked with Biden, more closely in his transition and in his campaign. She took herself out of the running. And so, this is, I think, a really interesting question, in part because I think that even within Democratic circles, there's a real split between those who represent a very traditional educator union position and those who are more on the what I'll call the education reform side of the puzzle. Not that those are mutually exclusive, but I do think this one's an interesting one to watch. And if Jen's back on, I'll mention a conversation she and I were having, and maybe she can weigh in if she's on, which is that, what's fascinating about the Secretary of Education, obviously very important to us who do work in the pre-K through higher ed field, probably one of the weakest cabinet members insofar as, the Department of Ed, the federal Department of Ed, has limited powers because, as we know, schools, particularly K-12 schools, run at the local level. But I think what we're going to see, regardless of whether it's one of the women on the screen or someone else, is a real shift, I think, in tone. I think I was listening to a fascinating discussion of this by I think her name is Kaya Hendrickson, who came from DC Public Schools, about the fact that what the Secretary of Ed can really do is use the position as a bully pulpit to push school districts, to push Congress for funding, to push reform. Obviously, we have in recent history, Arne Duncan, who, very activist Secretary of Education, pushed a lot of reform ideas, innovations down to the local level. So I think what we're really going to see here, regardless of who's appointed, is a real shift in the tone coming from the secretary. Certainly a pronounced shift from DeVos's focus on private schools, choice, to a real championing again of public education. Jen, I don't know if you have anything to add.
yeah, I mean, I most of these candidates are from K-12, which is traditionally the case. It would be interesting if someone from higher ed got in the mix. A lot of their budget and impact actually is in higher ed. As far as, I mean, Nikki and I did have a conversation. When you look at DeVos, the immediate issue of COVID and what can the Secretary of Education do about an issue like that? One thing that came to mind was, under the CARES Act, DeVos could have recommended waiver of IDEA requirements and decided not to, which was really interesting. We've had several labor unions take a position that those should be waived right now, and particularly procedural requirements. So you can see a real potential, not that these individuals might have exactly that position, but for example, if the Secretary of Education had taken the position, IDEA should be waived, that would have a real impact on many of us. And Nikki, you thought of another issue as far as the CARES funding and how that was prioritized.
Right, and those who are sort of down in the weeds on these issues will remember that DeVos came out very strongly in favor of certain CARES Act money going directly to private schools in such a way that certain districts were really going to lose a huge chunk of those federal dollars. And ultimately, her position was the Congress moved into that void. But I think it again really was indicative of her support for the private schools versus what we are likely to see in terms of the public schools and by the Biden administration. And one thing I will also say is Jen's exactly right. How much the Secretary of Education could have done under COVID is an open question, but certainly, lobbying for funds in Congress or championing some innovative work that was going on around the country, providing guidance, providing support for public schools. We didn't see a lot of that. Frankly, under DeVos, we are likely to see more of that kind of energy. Obviously, we'll talk later about Biden's push to get students back into schools, but even short of that, I think we'll see more involvement, certainly on these COVID issues, as you say, Jen.
Well, let's talk about, if you're getting nominated for a cabinet position, you get a press conference, you get a mention on the nightly news, but there are so many other important boards and agencies and commissions. So David, talk about the NLRB. There's a lot going on there potentially that maybe would be sort of below the radar a little bit, correct?
Below the radar and above the radar. I mean, if there's anything that constitutes contested ground, it's NLRB precedent. So just in terms of a bit of a background, there are at least two levels of structure that you need to appreciate with respect to the National Labor Relations Board, which of course has jurisdiction over labor relations in the private sector generally. First is the issue of the actual board itself. There are 5 board members. Currently, there are only 4, 3 Republicans, 1 Democrat. There is 1 vacancy. So when immediately upon inauguration, President Biden will be able to nominate a Democrat to fill that vacancy. Well, that will still leave, however, a 3-2 majority for the Republicans. Biden will not be able to secure a majority on the labor board until the fall of 2021. Because in August of 2021 is when the term of one of the Republican members, Bill Emanuel, expires. That will then allow President Biden to nominate a 3rd Democrat to the NLRB. Now, one thing to keep in mind about these appointments is they are subject to Senate confirmation. So to the extent that the Democrats do not control the Senate, that may have an impact on the ability of who, in particular, President Biden can get nominated to the labor board. The second element of structure here is there is a strong independent general counsel function within the NLRB. The general counsel for the NLRB is also subject to Senate confirmation. The current general counsel for the NLRB is a gentleman by the name of Peter Robb. His term doesn't expire until November of 2021. Most people anticipate that Mr. Robb will try to make the best use of whatever remaining time he has as general counsel to push some of his pet issues, and one of which, of course, happens to be Scabby the Rat. Those of us who live in the Chicago area have probably seen Scabby the Rat. In fact, driving into the office this morning, I drove past ComEd's construction site on California Avenue, and Scabby the Rat was right there on California Avenue. Peter Robb has made it a bit of a crusade to go after the Scabby the Rat and have it classified, really as an illegally coercive measure employed by unions. The upshot of this is that as important as the NLRB is, it's very unlikely that President Biden will be able, or his appointees to the NLRB will be able to make much of a change prior to 2022. There are certainly a number of cases that are expected to be raised before the NLRB. once he does have control, as it were, of the NLRB through both the board members and through the general counsel, there'll be a number of things the Biden team can do to push a labor agenda through. But another thing to keep in mind is that an NLRB decision is still subject to review in the United States Court of Appeals. And as we've known, and I think as Bill alluded to, President Trump made a number of appointments to the federal bench. So there is a very strong possibility that a number of NLRB decisions, even from a Biden labor board, will then be subject to scrutiny by a Trump appellate court panel. So that is also something to be leery of.
So Bill, let's talk about the EEOC and OSHA. You want to talk about the EEOC to start? Because there's obviously huge influence there, broad application, et cetera.
Yeah, sure. So the EEOC has a similar story to the NLRB. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has members who have fixed terms. So right now, there is a Republican majority on the commission, and that Republican majority will remain in place through at least mid-2022. The EEOC also has a general counsel who has a fixed term that is currently a Republican, Sharon Gustafson, whose term runs through 2023. So while we do expect a Biden administration to appoint members to the commission and to appoint a new general counsel, it is going to be some time before they're going to have a substantial impact on policy at the commission level. What is likely to happen in the short term, though, is that Biden will be able to nominate a new chair for the commission. That will likely be one of the Democratic commissioners. Charlotte Burrows is a front runner for the role. So the upshot of that would be, although the Democratic members are in the minority on the commission, Chairman Burrows would control the commission's agenda. So in the immediate short term, we're likely to see the Trump administration and the current the commission as it's currently constituted try to finalize some of the things that are in the hopper right now. Particularly, there's some regulations relating to the conciliation procedures that the EEOC uses to settle charges of discrimination that we expect to see a push to finalize before the inauguration. But then once a new chair is setting the agenda for the agency, a lot of the things that the Democrats might like to do, for example, going back to requiring disclosure of payroll data as part of the EEO-1 reports, unless that's done through another mechanism like legislation, some of those things may well be pushed off until there's a Democratic majority in place on the commission to push those initiatives through. OSHA is a little bit of a different story. So with OSHA, one of the first things that we expect the Biden administration to do is to nominate an Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health. That is a position that is subject to Senate confirmation. It is a position that has been vacant for quite some time now. There was a Trump nominee for the position that never received a confirmation from the Senate. So that role is currently vacant, which basically leaves OSHA without its top level political official. The agency is, in some sense, you could argue, rudderless at this point. The deputy assistant secretary who is currently in the role is not subject to Senate confirmation. So one of the first things we expect the administration to do is appoint that second in command for OSHA as a signal that the administration is taking occupational safety and health as an extremely high priority in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know we're going to talk in a little bit about what we expect from the administration on that front, but that appointment at OSHA and eventually, as soon as possible thereafter, getting the Senate confirmed assistant secretary into that position is going to be an extremely high priority.
And that certainly makes sense. Nikki, how about OCR? What are you expecting there? What are you hearing?
Yeah, there's really, I really don't know who they're going to appoint as the head of the Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Ed, but we wanted to flag that because I think it is a position to watch closely for the folks, a lot of the folks likely on the call today or on the webinar today. Obviously we've seen, I think there was a considerable pendulum swing, obviously, between what we saw as OCR's enforcement priorities from under the Obama administration to what occurred under the Trump administration. And we're going to talk about civil rights and the focus of the Biden administration. And we're going to see that no better place than in the Office of Civil Rights in terms of their approach and also what they're prioritizing. Just as an example, we saw under Trump a real shift to prioritizing religious freedom and religious civil rights claims. We are likely to see, again, a swing back, I think, to more traditional looks at race, at gender. We'll talk a little bit about transgender today. So those issues, I think, are going to be more on the forefront of the Biden OCR priority list as opposed to the Trump.
Well, in terms of the important issues, obviously, Joe Biden's principal argument on the campaign trail was the effectiveness of our nation's response to COVID. Bill, you touched on this a little bit, but looking at sort of the principal things that he's going to want to do, where do you see the presidential power being exercised with respect to the COVID response?
Well, I can talk about that specifically with respect to the workplace. That's sort of my area of concentration. As I said, one of the first things we expect to see out of the box are key appointments at the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And we expect to see a very high priority for the administration being publishing an emergency temporary standard dealing with COVID-19 protection and preparedness in the workplace. Interestingly, and somewhat surprisingly, despite a lot of pressure and people pushing for the federal government to take a lead in this area, there has not been a standard from OSHA on this issue. OSHA has taken on investigations and engaged in some enforcement activity under the General Duty Clause under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, but it hasn't issued specific standards. And essentially, it's left it to the states and local governments to actually set requirements for businesses, employers, as they try to deal with the pandemic. So, again, we do expect to see a lot more affirmative leadership from the federal government trying to coordinate how this is being done on a national level than we have seen up until now.
David, do you see any enhanced obligations to bargain from this activity?
Oh, absolutely, Ars. I mean, there will be an intersection between enhanced enforcement, stricter regulations on the OSHA front with what we all expect a Biden labor board, certainly beginning in 2022. One of the things we had seen during the Trump administration with the Trump labor board was a contraction of most employers' duty to bargain under a variety of circumstances. It's reasonable to assume that a Biden labor board will expand an employer in the private sector again, expand the scope of a private employer's obligation to bargain over these issues. So not only will private employers be faced with or confronted with an increased vigilance, increased standards coming out of OSHA, there's also going to, in all likelihood, going to be an increased duty and increased obligation, a more onerous obligation to bargain with unions over those very standards.
Nikki, let's talk about reopening of schools. That's an issue that has been in our laps collectively since March, affecting so many people across the state, so many clients. Where do you see the new president putting his impressions on this issue?
Sure. Thanks, Harris. Yeah, Biden has said, I'm sure folks have seen, that he wants to see schools opening, in the next, 100 days within his inauguration. Obviously, what we've seen across the country is a real patchwork of some schools opening fully, some schools being shut down since last March, and some schools in sort of a hybrid. And then obviously the fourth option is people going in and out of those different scenarios, right? So we've seen all of it, and there's really been no consistency, certainly even within Illinois, as we know. as I mentioned before, Congress has, and the federal government, the Secretary of Education, Biden, have limited roles in terms of issues of reopening, because this is obviously a local decision. However, what Biden has said that he may do at the federal level that might help move that reopening along is, first of all, prioritizing vaccines for educators. Obviously, we know the first wave are health care workers and our most vulnerable residents in places like nursing homes and the like, and our older citizens. But I think educators are sort of next on that list for Biden because of their then ability to go back into school buildings. I think the second piece of this is, again, funding for reopening from Congress. Really, that is dependent on Congress, obviously, and where they go with that, but that we could see a real push. And again, prioritizing that is going to have a different impact, I think, than what we saw certainly under Trump and under the DeVos administration of the Department of Ed. So I think those two things. We did get a question in the chat from one of our friends in DuPage about assessment, whether assessments will be waived. I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it sort of dovetails with what Jen was talking about earlier about special ed requirements. We're going to have to see what kind of authority the department has. Obviously, these are federal statutes that would need to be waived, and whether there's a CARES Act that allows that kind of waiving of various requirements, including assessment. I know assessment is on people's minds because it's really difficult to do and it takes a lot of time, and we're trying to maybe alleviate some of those burdens. So I definitely would not be surprised if we see some push to try to pare back some of those requirements so that folks can reopen successfully. I think it's really yet to be seen.
Well, in addition to COVID, another issue that's really ripped from the headline are implementation of the civil rights laws and equity. We've heard a lot about that this year. Jen, talk about Title IX a little bit and what's happening there and what changes you foresee.
Sure. Well, this is an area where eventual change is nearly guaranteed. The new Title IX regulations that took effect August 14th have been repeatedly denounced, I would say, by President-elect Biden. And there's really no question that this will be on the list of priorities to address. Now, our colleague, Jackie Werns, did a really deep dive in what are the options that the new administration has. Regulations, unlike we were talking about guidance or the blog, I mean, that can be wiped away on day one. Regulations, to change those, it's a lengthy process, as Bill kind of walked through. Keeping in mind, to pass these regulations, it took about 2 years. And so that gives you kind of a benchmark of, even if that process was expedited, we're certainly not talking about a change in this school year. Unlikely, when we think about the time it takes to make change, unlikely that we have major changes, in time for next school year. So this is a long-term project, and I think it's unlikely that we just simply go back to the way the law was before. Instead, what we're looking at is targeted changes where we may keep some things that people think were good about the new regulations and then make adjustments. So I see it as a new paradigm, not just going back to the old paradigm as the most likely next phase.
Nikki, why don't you talk about some of the procedural things you see changing in this area too?
Yeah, it's not, I think Jen's exactly right. I mean, this is a long-term project, and I agree. I don't think we're going to see a complete just sort of jettison of these new regulations, but at least on the K-12, and I know higher ed and K-12 are dealing with these pieces, and they're different, I guess, in these different venues. I think for the K-12, what we are, I think, hopeful to see is a little bit of a retraction of some of the more onerous procedural requirements, as you mentioned, Eris. So, at the K-12 level, having sort of written, cross-examination, discovery, all the people who are in the weeds on Title IX sort of know what I'm talking about, but just the very sort of onerous process that's going on is really an odd fit for a K-12 environment. I mean, one of the things that, and I was talking to Jackie about this yesterday, because she's been doing a lot of our, as Jen has, a lot of our Title IX trainings and work with school districts, is we have school districts that are small and simply don't have enough people to fill all the roles that these new regulations require. So, whereas at the higher ed level, there's a lot more ability to implement some of these processes, these roles, these requirements. At the K-12 level, it really does feel sometimes like a square hole and a round peg. And so I think we're hopeful to see a little bit of some of the softening of those requirements for better implementation, ultimately to get to the goal, which we all want, which is to protect students, to protect staff, to make sure investigations are done effectively so that resolution can be arrived at.
And I want to piggyback on that just a little bit. An issue that I think impacts both higher ed and K-12, which is the way the Title IX regs fit with other laws. So in the higher ed space, for example, how it meshes with requirements for tenure revocation. The fact is it doesn't. You're at, right now you're picking your poison as far as which law you're not complying with, and that's not tenable. So as far as what I think they'll change, what I hope they'll change is that kind. I mean, at a minimum, that kind of thing needs to be cleaned up. Those same issues that apply to faculty at the higher ed also now are a problem for school districts in K-12 when you're talking about teacher discipline. And remember, we have tenure and processes there too. So anytime you have a state law that requires a process regarding addressing an employment situation, they are just not harmonizing with these new regs. So that's one big issue that we hope to have changed.
So Jen, earlier you mentioned IDEA. What do you see happening in the special ed area under a Biden administration? Changes, more of the same? What do you see?
It's interesting. For the most part, the proposals we've seen out there are just, and not just, but involve increasing funding, and it's IDEA has not been fully funded for a long time. A lot of the advocacy, the focus has been on increasing funding, increasing resources as far as mental health supports and those personnel. So whether it's psychologists, counselors, nurses, social workers, making sure there's funding for all those folks, especially as we have kids come back. I'm seeing a lot of rather, concerning information from our clients as far as the mental health needs of students out there. So I know that is a priority. Also, funding of early childhood has also been an issue mentioned. Again, I think as far as IDEA, if we get past COVID and we get past, funding issues, and if we assumed that there was appropriate funding, IDEA has not been reauthorized since 2004. It's always been mentioned as, it's actually a rather popular law on for both Republicans and Democrats. The idea of supporting students with disabilities has resonance on that's pretty broad. So there's been a lot of proposals that it's time to reauthorize IDEA for a long time. It could be one of those kind of bipartisan things that someone decides to pick up because of maybe the lower level of controversy, and one of those things that everyone can get behind. So I wouldn't be shocked if, once again, we get past COVID, that's one of the issues that is taken up.
Bill, how about some of these issues of sexual harassment and gender equity with private sector employers? What do you see changing under a Biden administration?
Yeah, so in that area, I guess the most immediate impact that we're likely to see is not going to be on private sector employers generally. It's going to be really on employers that do business with the federal government, federal contractors. There, the president can issue executive orders or roll back executive orders that were issued by the prior administration without having to go through either Congress or an onerous rulemaking process. So we do expect, for example, early on, perhaps one of the day one initiatives is rolling back some of the executive orders that were issued by the Trump administration. For example, the executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping that relates to diversity training initiatives. And that will certainly have an impact, not just on employers, but on a swath of organizations, including educational entities that do business with the federal government or receive federal funds. So there's definitely going to be rapid change there. I think what's going to take more time, for example, we talked about the EEOC and how it will take some time for the new administration to exert influence over the commission through appointments. I do expect as those appointments take effect and as the administration is able to exert more control, that, for example, we'll see the EEOC reinstating pay reporting requirements in the EEO1 report, or at least pushing to do that. We may also see the EEOC taking more aggressive approaches to pattern and practice litigation against employers, loosening procedural rules that the agency follows for those investigations, some of which the Trump administration put into place. And lastly, I think across a lot of enforcement agencies, including the EEOC, we're going to see a push for increased hiring of investigators. Now, obviously, that piece is going to require some funding, which in turn is going to require some degree of cooperation from Congress. So how much we see of that remains to be seen.
Jan or Nikki, talk about what you foresee with transgender students too. That's an issue we've seen with a lot of our clients. Any foreseeable changes on that front?
If we're talking here in Illinois, I don't think we're going to see a dramatic change because it's pretty well established under our state law and then our federal court precedent in the Seventh Circuit that gender identity is a protected characterization. Students need access to facilities, including things like restrooms and locker rooms. So we've kind of been operating under that as the guiding law in this area. Now, in other parts of the country where the state laws are different and the federal court precedent has not made it up to the Supreme Court, so we're operating in the Seventh Circuit. It could be a shift because I think we'll again see the Department of Ed and OCR enforce the interpretation of Title IX that it does protect gender identity and does require access, access to facilities includes things like locker rooms and bathrooms. So I don't expect a huge change for the people on this webinar, but it really depends where you're located.
How about for-profit colleges and universities? There's sort of been waxing and waning of interest from the government with respect to those entities. Nikki or Jen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll get us started. So there's some key things that have been thrown out by the president-elect's office, including reinstating the gainful employment rule and broadening the 90-10 rule, which are checks or intended to restrict funding for-profit schools. And one thing that I just find really interesting, Kamala Harris is somewhat well known for a lawsuit she filed against a for-profit when she was in her role as California's Attorney General, and won a very large, I think a $1.1 billion federal court judgment against a now bankrupt for-profit based on the issue of using fraudulent advertising. So they had used apparently military SEALs in their advertising. So she has a personal background with this issue. I just can't imagine that it won't be on the list of priorities, knowing, there's both their statements and then some personal experience that, again, the Vice President-elect has.
Nikki, how about with respect to the resegregation or desegregation of public schools?
Sure. I think overall there's going to be a focus within the Biden administration on equity and education. So we're going to see that. I know Jen mentioned funding, Title I funding, I think is going to be a big focus and a big push for the Biden administration. Obviously that Title I funding goes to our most impoverished students. In terms of, I think also what I've seen from the Biden administration is both a focus on funding and resources for schools in low-income neighborhoods, so where students are at, and not having that dictate the kind of education that they are receiving. But as you said, Eris, I think there's also going to be a refocus on desegregation of schools. Under the Obama administration, there was some fairly robust guidance around this issue, and I think we might see that resurrected. And also possibly, I know that Biden campaign talked about grant programs for desegregations of schools. Obviously, They will be bumping up against a lot of Supreme Court precedents that have sort of come the other way on desegregation efforts. So it'll be interesting to see how those issues play out. As we know that there is still a substantial amount of desegregation work likely to be done in various parts of the country. So I think equity overall, but certainly those issues as well.
No, that's one interesting, with the Seattle superintendent on our list of potentials. I think she's only been I'm not sure history there with Seattle during the time of the lawsuits, but they are the school district involved in a key kind of modern day desegregation initiative. They had a plan as far as controlled choice and balancing schools based on racial background. So they've been innovative, I would say, in their approach to looking at that issue and have a history of working on that issue. So that's an interesting match with her as a potential Secretary of Education.
You know, so really the third main issue that we've identified through the Biden campaign and the information that his incoming administration is addressing is worker protection. And so, David, can you talk a little bit about labor relations in that regard and more in the bargaining side of things?
Sure, Eris. So I would break this down really into three areas. First is the influence of the NLRB once President Biden has control of the NLRB. You know, those of us who have practiced in private sector labor relations, who've practiced before the NLRB, realize that the history of the NLRB is basically like the 30 Years' War, with Democrat and Republican majorities, you know, marching back and forth across the same battlefields over and over again. Certainly beginning in 2022, there are a number of Trump-era labor board decisions that are in the crosshairs of a Biden administration. And among them, and in no particular order, is everything from how bargaining unit configurations. A more union-friendly NLRB will make it easier for unions to organize and obtain recognition within a so-called micro unit, to get a toehold into an employer's operation, rather than having to organize across a broad spectrum of the employer's operations. We're certainly going to see issues of a Biden labor board putting an emphasis on a union's ability to get access to employees through at least one of a couple of different ways, either through an employer's email system, which is a case that was decided during the Trump era, as well as union organizers to have access to the physical property or the physical premises of the employer in order to organize. We're also going to see certainly some issues. We will certainly see issues on the issue of an employer's obligation to bargain midterm. In other words, what unilateral changes an employer makes during the term of a collective bargaining agreement that would trigger a bargaining obligation. During the Trump era, we saw a pulling back of what that scope of that obligation, of what that bargaining obligation is. I fully expect that to expand during a Biden labor board, as well as a different focus, a renewed focus on joint employers, and a more relaxed test for determining who is or which parties are joint employers, which would mean additional employers being hauled into the bargaining table and having to sit at the bargaining table across the table from a union and actually engage in the give and take of good faith bargaining. In addition to secondary activities and employee versus independent contractor classification. Second is the issue really of more immediate things that a Biden administration might do. And there are at least two things, two weapons, two avenues for immediate change. At the NLRB, there is the ability for a general counsel for a region to obtain adjunctive relief against an employer. It's a so-called 10J injunction. Traditionally, it's sparingly used. It's reasonable to expect that a Biden administration, especially a Biden-appointed general counsel, will make more aggressive use of that injunctive relief. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's an injunction that can be obtained after the issuance of a complaint, but before the case is ever heard. So this can involve a situation where an employer is ordered by the district court to reinstate employees it fired. It may be a situation where an employer may have subcontracted or gotten rid of some work, and the court orders bring the work back, have it done by the bargaining unit employees. That is one arrow, certainly in the Biden labor board quiver. Another, of course, is the power of the purse, which is the procurement issue, Many of us who are, practice in Illinois are very familiar with so-called responsible bidder ordinances. It's reasonable to expect that a Biden administration, in terms of its procurement, will require those who are bidding on federal work, on federal contracts, to say enter into neutrality agreements, to have a higher minimum wage that they commit to paying, and other labor protection provisions. And that can affect anywhere between 3 to 4 to 5 million employees. Finally, and just very briefly, is a legislative agenda. We've heard some talk about the so-called PRO Act, the Protection for the Right to Organize. That would codify a whole slew of very strong pro-union organizing rights. But of course, that is going to he would have to get that through Congress. And it's difficult to see that happening unless under the Senate as it's currently constituted.
Thank you, David. Hey, Bill, we're close, right around 1 o'clock, but I know there are some worker protection issues you wanted to raise. Can you give us a quick overview on those?
Yeah, absolutely, Eris. So, and just to answer one question that was asked in the Q&A relating to this subject, the question was, is there any talk of an extension for the Families First Coronavirus Response Act paid leave provisions? Yeah, there's lots of talk about it. I don't know that there's talk of it in Congress as part of the relief package that's currently being negotiated. We've been watching that pretty closely, and none of the summaries that I've seen have referenced any extension of those leave provisions. So as far as we can tell right now, those leave provisions are going to still expire after December 31st. May well be reinstated sometime in the new year, and it's possible that might happen retroactively, although that would be something of a mess. But as of right now, there doesn't seem to be anything official on that subject. Just talking about a couple of other sort of workplace protection or worker protection initiatives that the Biden campaign highlighted and that may be priorities in the new administration. As David mentioned, there are some pieces of proposed legislation. For example, there is part of the campaign platform, there's a proposal to adopt the California ABC test for independent contractors that would dramatically limit the kinds of workers that can be classified as independent contractors as compared to the current law. And this is an issue that has received a lot of attention in California, and frankly, a lot of pushback from people like freelancers, journalists, for example, who all of a sudden found themselves getting termination letters from the publications that they had written for because they couldn't be considered freelancers or independent contractors under those new rules. I don't think we're likely to see that legislation under the Congress as it's currently constituted, and it seems relatively unlikely, even if the Democrats manage to take the 2 Senate seats that are up for grabs in Georgia. But it is a proposal. What we do expect to see from the Biden administration, though, is very strong emphasis on enforcing existing rules for independent contractors and using the tools that the administration has. So issuing guidance, perhaps reissuing some guidance that was issued by the Obama administration and then repealed or taken back by the Trump administration relating to how the Department of Labor construes the concept of independent contractor and will apply that in its enforcement activities. And as we saw in the Obama administration, the Biden campaign platform talked about a very strong partnership among federal agencies like the Department of Labor and the IRS, as well as partnering with state and local agencies like state revenue agencies and unemployment agencies to go after employers that misclassify workers as independent contractors. So that's definitely one dimension. There has been talk of seeking an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Again, that would require an act of Congress, and it doesn't seem terribly likely to occur as of right now, but it was definitely a proposal from the Biden campaign. more likely is an effort to revive the Obama era overtime regulations. As you may recall, the minimum salary for overtime exemptions was significantly increased under regulations that would have taken effect under the Obama administration. That was stricken down by a district court in Texas, and those regulations never took effect. There may be another try at getting those regulations into force, but you can expect a very similar pushback in court on those efforts. So a number of initiatives along these same lines that we can expect, in addition to generally a more aggressive posture in enforcement activity and a push for additional funding for enforcement actions and hiring additional investigators at the various federal agencies. So a lot of action that we can expect in the months to come.
Well, thank you, Bill. And we've exceeded our hour, and we appreciate you being with us. That wraps up the seminar today. I want to thank Nikki and Jennifer, David, and Bill for sharing their expertise and perspective. And mostly, we want to thank you for joining us today. We greatly appreciate your time and questions. We're going to be posting this webinar on the firm website. An email will go out as well. We encourage you to share it with your colleagues and friends. In the new year, we anticipate additional webinars we're programming once we have more information from the Biden administration and a little bit more to talk about as well. So thank you again. Best wishes for the holidays and Happy New Year's to all.